Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Majlis, and I'm very happy indeed today to introduce you to those of you who don't know him, a dear friend and wonderful scholar, Christian. And yes, so I know Christian for quite a while. I met him at several occasions in different conferences. He also came to Exeter to visit us, which was a delight. And yeah, well, he's both a formidable scholar and human being, and I know him mostly through as a scholar, and he would be intimidating, because of his knowledge and intellect. Shouldn't if he were not the most a straightforward and kind and generous person at the same time. So and indeed he is a role model for how to behave in scholarly majlises, an incarnation of the Adab al-Majlis, which I had the privilege to see many times. I remember once at an occasion when he asked me, wasn't I too critical? And no, he was just right, because he said he has this straightforward. He will say if he sees something that should be said, but he will say in a way that it is never hurtful, and he will say it in a way that it's never for the purpose to belittle the other scholar. Rather, he honors everyone, and he would never put him on a high pedestal ever. So I'm yeah. Those who know him, you surely know that about him, and today, due to his usual modesty, he asked me to ask him questions rather than presenting himself. And yeah, I was thinking about these questions and think, just to go easy and simple, let's cover past, present, and future, everything. So maybe start. Well, we can ask. I can ask such a simple question as who are you? Who are you, Christian? If you can, yeah. What would you say if I ask you who are you?
Well, I think there's probably a boring but satisfactory professional answer, which anyone could glean from Googling my name, and that is I'm an associate professor of Islamic history here at Oxford. I'm a fellow at New College. But I suppose that's not the very interesting answer. And what makes the Majlis unique, as far as I understand it, is you're trying to kind of get behind the information that may be publicly available. So who am I really? Well, what actually fills my day, and the most important part of my day, is I'm married with two small children. So I have the professor's hat, and even more important than that, I have the father's hat. And my wife and I have a little boy who's just over 2 and a little girl who's just over 1. So they're very close in age, and they keep us very, very busy. And I'd like to think that they keep me very grounded too. So they have no interest in early Islamic history. They have no interest in late antiquity or Zoroastrianism or any of the things that occupy me from 9 to 5. And I like that. I like having a bit of balance in my life. So that's an important part of my life. I'm an American living here in Britain. So I suppose that's something else that is an important aspect of my life. I grew up just outside New York City and New Jersey. I come from a long family of New Yorkers. And so I grew up in a place when the city meant only one thing. It didn't refer to the financial district of London as it does to Brits here. The city meant New York City. So that was a big frame of reference for me. And that's where my extended family on my side lives. So yeah, I think that's maybe a good starting place for who I am. You can keep drilling me, Škand, but
yeah. Well, I will.
That's what you're looking for.
I will, because then the next question is that how did you become what made you become what you are? So basically, it's about your family, your background, maybe also your studies. How did you started these studies? Why did you do so? What led you?
Well, I think it's true that many people in our field often have a family connection with the region or with the religions that we study. I can't claim any Arab ancestry. I have no Iranian ancestry. I'm not a Muslim. Occasionally, I get a befuddled question from someone in the Middle East who is clearly confused as to where I come from, and I take that as a high compliment that my spoken Arabic is not too terrible if they think maybe I had a Lebanese father or grandfather. But no, I'm a typical American mutt. Most of my family ancestry is actually Irish, despite my very German-sounding name. So anyway, that was my family background. As to how I got interested in this, I mean, neither one of my parents is an academic, but growing up, they valued learning. We were encouraged to read, my siblings and I. In the summers, we would have competitive reading contests. And at the end of the summer, depending on who read the most, there would be a little prize in it for you. So it's a bit of incentive to plow through your books. So I loved reading, and part of growing up near New York City was to visit its museums, especially the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the cloisters, that kind of thing. And so I never imagined I'd become a professor of the history of the Middle East. But I certainly grew up around books and was taught that history was very, very important. Art was important. Culture was important. Religion was important. I'm a Catholic. I was brought up as a Catholic, and so I think religion as an aspect of society was for me something that's very, very interesting, and was not something I felt I studied as an outsider, but was something that to some extent I understood intuitively because it was a significant part of my family background, and indeed is a significant part of, I think, how American society is structured in lots of ways. There's huge variation, but I think that's undoubtedly an important part of the national character in the United States, this sometimes fraught but always interesting relationship between religion and public life. So that's what I was brought up around. As to how I found my way into this, it was really circuitous. My journey into Islamic history is perhaps not as dramatic as people that begin in mathematics or physics and find their way into Arabic and Persian, but I had a very inspiring teacher in high school who was actually a teacher of studio art, but one of the things he taught on the side was the history of art. In American high schools, they offer a program of study called advanced placement, and basically advanced placement gives you the opportunity to take introductory university level courses while you're still at school. And if you pass a national exam, then you get credit, and that credit can then apply to your undergraduate studies. And at its best, it can get you, a year off if you do enough of these. It might even get you a discount because you could potentially graduate a year early. I didn't do any of that, but I had the good fortune to take some of these classes. And one of them was the advanced placement university level history of art course. And what I loved about it was that I thought that art, visual culture, monuments, cities, all of these things that you can look at are the ultimate passport into distant cultures. So in a way, I was hooked by images and objects and monuments before I was hooked by texts. But I was always interested in the ancient and the medieval. So on from this very inspiring experience at my high school in New Jersey, I went on to Princeton. My first degree was in the history of art and architecture. And then from there, I went into a slightly more recognizable path, studying more textual approaches to history at a later stage. And I migrated from having studied the history of late antiquity into the study of early Islam. And that's still more or less where I am. I'm interested in that transition between those two important periods. But in some ways, I had an idiosyncratic education that began with a very broad introduction to ancient and medieval cultures. And ultimately, after many years of undergraduate and later graduate study, I ended up studying early Islamic history and its relationship with the late ancient world.
That's very interesting. And did you do any research on art and architecture eventually? I don't remember.
I haven't done much. The closest thing I have done in my professional career has been to write about iconoclasm in the early Islamic period. So several years ago, I wrote a long article about the iconoclastic edict of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid II, which is a curious, short-lived episode. But so anyway, to write that article, I had to look at texts, of course, but I was also consulting visual evidence. So I haven't done a lot with my first degree. I guess the most I would say is I'm not scared of images, and my art historian colleagues tell me that we textual historians tend to be scared of images, and I suppose that's not me. So who knows what the future holds.
Just admitting someone. Yeah. Well, it's just, I'm just reading a thesis which I will have to examine tomorrow, and I saw one of your papers referred in it, and that give a taste of the variety of your scholarship. And this is this second sexual revolution in the medieval Middle East. Yes, so can you please tell us about your research and what led you while you were already in the field of history? How did you make your choices of what topics to discuss?
My PhD thesis at Princeton was supervised by Michael Cook and Peter Brown. So I had amazing teachers, and if I do nothing else in my life, to have studied under those eminent historians was, in my mind, an amazing experience. And in some ways, I think what I ended up working on was somewhere between Michael and Peter's interests. Chronologically, it was more in Michael's world, but some of the themes related more closely to Peter's world. So that my PhD thesis, which eventually came out as a book, was about Christian martyrdom narratives from the early Islamic period, basically martyrdom narratives written by Christians from the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, or at least set in those periods. So again, it was a topic that had not really been worked on before. It was this corpus of important non-Muslim sources that spoke about the early Islamic period. And of course, that's one of the great topics of debate in our field, how to reconstruct the events of early Islamic history on the basis of non-Muslim sources. That's a debate that goes back to Hagerism in the 1970s, one of Michael's early books that he wrote with Patricia Cronin. And so it was an interesting body of sources to work through, written in many languages, so that I thought played to my strengths, as given my slightly circuitous route into early Islamic history. And as a topic, it was one that was fundamentally about a body of literary sources, but it was also about social and religious change of the kind that interested me a great deal. So the occasion for martyrdom, so-called martyrdom in the early Islamic period, were things like apostasy and blasphemy. So through these narratives, you could begin to ask interesting questions about how is it that this predominantly Christian world of late antiquity in places like Egypt, Greater Syria, the Caucasus, slowly began to transform into the predominantly Muslim world that we know today, the role that violence did or did not play in that process, memories of violence, that kind of thing. So it ticked a lot of boxes, and it kept me occupied. And I think that's a good sign. A sign of a hopefully successful PhD thesis is one that keeps the writer occupied and entertained, and you don't fall out of love with it. Unfortunately, that happens with graduate students, and that did not happen with me.
In that, it's yeah, this is a question I didn't prepare to ask, and yeah, I'm discussing shortly in a paper something which I've just seen that Hayrettin, who was our guest previously, Hayrettin Yüce, very, very eloquently that discusses in his Disenchanting the Caliphate is the use of Islamic, and not just in the Hudsonian Shahab Ahmadian sense, but yeah, just to it seems very wrong to me to call the West. Yeah, we call the West, then we talk about China, and then India, and then we talk about the Islamic world, and it kind of defines that civilization as more religious than others, more defined by religion than others. And yeah, I would be very interested in your opinion in that, given that you study this culture, this civilization, or this, I don't know whether civilization is the right term either, but yes, this era and area with an interest to other religions as well, which were actually in the early period, at least, definitely a majority when it comes to numbers. Yes. Do you have any things to say about this improvised question?
I had plenty to say.
Okay.
Maybe too much to say. I mean, the first thing I would say is that if anyone is interested in reading my views of this, idiosyncratic though they may be, I published essentially a position piece, something of an academic polemic in the English Historical Review just a few months ago, which is called "What is Islamic History? Okay. Muslims, non-Muslims, and the history of everyone else." And you can find it on open access online. And but basically, that piece has grown out of my experience teaching or being asked to teach a subject, Islamic history, here at Oxford, and to discover gradually that this subject that I represent institutionally, in which I operate as a scholar, in which I have many dear friends and colleagues from whom I learn, is basically framed in terms that I don't think intellectually I can understand, or not understand, but rather accept. And by that, I mean, it's precisely what you've said. For much of the early Islamic period, this early Islamic empire is incredibly heterogeneous. It's extremely diverse. In many of these places, Christians still constitute a majority of the population. Throughout much of the Iranian world, we assume the same was true of Zoroastrians. There are huge Jewish communities. And Muslims are obviously the most visible portion of the population, but relative to these other groups, they are a minority. I mean, that's not controversial. Most of us don't stop to think about it, but it's true. Muslims were relatively few in number at the beginning, and they become, they grow in number. They're influential. They rule this empire from the very beginning. But the existence of a Muslim empire does not necessarily entail the existence of a Muslim society. And at some point, it dawned on me that this was the case. And at least for me, because I approached Islamic history, so to speak, having spent many years studying adjacent late antique and early medieval empires, my starting assumptions were perhaps somewhat different from somebody else who had maybe been steeped in the discipline from an earlier date. And by that, I mean, I was originally interested in everyone else. And in fact, one of the reasons that I began studying Arabic was that in the process of writing my senior thesis at Princeton about the city of Jerusalem in late antiquity, both as a physical space, as an imaginative space that could be emulated, replicated in other cities of the Mediterranean. Every book I read about Jerusalem, written from the point of view of late antique or Byzantine studies, kind of ended with the 7th century. And the 7th century is, of course, the era of the conquests. And at that early stage, I thought to myself, well, why is it these books end? I mean, what changes in this world? Why don't we keep going? And of course, it changes because of the rise of Islam, the conquests, and all of the disciplinary distinctions that entails. So in some ways, I got interested in the study of Islamic history precisely in order to study these continuities and discontinuities of what had come before. And if you approach the subject, if you approach this empire with the assumption that not nearly as much changes as we think it does, and there are groups in society that deserve attention that we perhaps don't pay too much attention to, suddenly the discipline of Islamic history looks a little wacky. And so, why is it that we foreground one religion in the story of the history of this empire in this region, when in fact it was a multi-religious world? Why is it that we foreground even religion as the centerpiece of how we approach this world? I mean, for instance, in universities today, we don't talk about medieval European history as being the history of Christendom or about being Christian history as perhaps people once did. And yet that is the implicit framework with which we approach the study of the early medieval, the medieval Middle East, North Africa, much of Central Asia. So anyway, to go back to the piece I mentioned, it's essentially an engagement with this idea and a proposal of several alternatives that might help us write the history of the region in a more inclusive fashion. By inclusive, I mean essentially approaching the history of the region on its own terms and reflecting the society as it was, not the partial view of the society that we get from our sources or which we as modern historians happen to think is most significant or interesting.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Christian. Yeah. I just remembered a beautiful piece by Graeber towards the end of his life about the petrification of memories, I believe, in Jerusalem, which of course went on, and it's a beautiful way to write in academia how he did that, kind of painting landscapes of Jerusalem academic painting, I would call it nearly. Yes, and then the only thing which comes out ready I know about this way in a being is Pallas Athene in full armor from Zeus's head. So when something is ready and all done, that is because it's an intellectual construct somehow. So it is strange that very often still Islam is looked at as something which came to being and like Pallas Athene, and then it is what it is, and doesn't change. So yeah, it is still a dominant narrative, though of course much less now in academia, luckily, to the work also due to the work of people like you. Now, so what about your future? What plans do you have? What you would like to be, what you would like to become, and how would you like to be, and what you would and how do you plan to go ahead?
What do I want to be? That's a big question to which I don't have a very good answer. I can tell you what I admire in a scholar, and they're really the traits that I see in my teachers. The type of historian I admire is someone who has great technical facility, who is a philologist in the best sense of the term, someone who can navigate sources deftly and with precision, with an eye to detail. In other words, someone who really sees the trees, but who manages to pair that skill and that facility with a really wide-angle view of history and knows the right questions to ask. And I think often one skill develops at the expense of another. So we operate in academic systems that say if they privilege philology, people are encouraged to essentially present narrow glimpses of subjects. And by the same token, people who are trained to paint vast vistas, that skill comes at the expense of technical precision or an attention to sources in the broadest sense of the term, whether those be texts or archaeological evidence or whatever. And so for me, and what I try to tell my students is that if you can operate at both levels, that's amazing. So those are skills that I see in my teachers, among others, Peter Brown and Michael Cook, and it's something that I strive to emulate in my work, and it's something I try to teach my students. And I think it's also important in a field like ours, which is not necessarily in the center of historical study at a Western university, whether it's here in Britain or the United States or elsewhere. I think it's also important to write the kind of history that can reach outside of the discipline and make the field accessible, interesting, and attractive to those who have no prior training. And so that entails hopefully asking questions that can invite parallels, invite comparisons and contrasts with other fields. And indeed, I think my research has often been its most fruitful when I'm in conversation or otherwise influenced by people who have nothing to do with the study of the Middle East, whether in the medieval period or any other. I wish I could do it better. Again, we are siloed, and it's very, very difficult to resist that, especially when one is teaching and busy with other things. But again, I admire depth as well as breadth. And as for where I'm going, I'm in the middle of writing a new book, which will be on the longer side, which is essentially about the Islamization of mountainous regions of what begins as the early Muslim empire. And why that's interesting is that mountainous regions, like other geographically challenging terrains, were very often difficult to conquer and to integrate into imperial systems. So I'm interested in mountains as places that were very hard to kind of attach onto the caliphate. And yet these were places where Islamization still unfolded. So it's in some ways the story of Islamization without central or imperial political authority. And I'm also interested in what happens when states eventually do form in these areas. So the book is essentially a sustained comparison of three regions from late antiquity until roughly the year 1000. So that's North Africa and various mountain ranges there, the coastal mountains of Syria, Lebanon, and the Caspian. So each in their own way, they point to this common paradigm, terrain, foiling the forces of imperialism. And because they are remote from imperial power, they often follow their own path in matters of religion above all. So I'm interested in these areas as places that were slow to convert to Islam. And when they eventually did convert to Islam, the forms of Islam that took root there were, in one way or another, often out of step with what the caliphs of the day were promoting and advocating. So the classic example of this is Syria and Lebanon, where the mountains are a relatively compact geographic area, but have an incredible variety of religious and social life. You have various Christian communities, most famously the Maronites, who form as a community and institution in the Islamic period, existing alongside a wide variety of different Muslim groups, most famously the Druze, but also the Nusayris or the Alawis, as well as the Ismailis. So it's basically a study of the intersection between the physical environment, imperial power, and religious change.
That's most interesting, but also a colossal study, just well, because of the three different regions.
Yeah.
To think about North Africa as well, the Rifis and the
exactly, yeah. Well, I don't want to. The goal was not to write a history of any one of these regions. I think that ultimately my value add is to present these side by side. So it's tough. As I said, the book will probably be on the longer side, and that's partly because in order to write the history of these regions, I'm having to do a huge amount of primary research that has either never been done before or happened a very long time ago and now needs to be updated. So that requires detail of the kind I was describing earlier and attention to the trees. But then I have this larger synthetic argument I'd like to make, and that's about comparison and contrast. So when the book eventually comes out, I think it will perhaps rise or fall depending on how I manage to balance those things and attention to the details, histories of these specific regions, but then the broad comparison and the big point that applies to lots of regions and indeed potentially applies to fields outside our own.
Yeah. Sajjad had his professorial inaugural lecture a week ago, and then he discussed decolonialization, and I'm very much into what you said, into the decompartmentalization, because that's really a huge danger. All over academia, that we lose that vision on the forest, or we lose the ability to really look at the tree. Yes, either of them is really dangerous, and it's and then the wisdom and philosophy what Sajjad was talking about is lost if we don't do it the way you suggest we do. So thank you. This is a really good objective, not just for you, but I think for many of us. Now, as a last question on what advice you could give that you would like us to remember, or what examples, and here is, well, obviously you are someone very successful, not just in achieving, but actually in what you produced, and this is a lucky coincidence. But so on challenges, what we faced, you face, and how to solve them, how to overcome them, or how to deal with them. Can you tell us anything that could help us at any level where we are, from students to colleagues?
Maybe I can return some advice that was given to me many years ago. So I mentioned two of my important teachers, my PhD supervisors, Peter and Michael. But there was another person at Princeton as an undergraduate and later as a graduate student who was extremely important for me, and it took it in a very different field. This is going back to my days as an art historian. His name was Slobodan Čorčić, who died just a few years ago. Danny Čorčić was Serbian and an extremely distinguished architectural historian of the Byzantine world. So his magnum opus, which appeared probably about 10 to 15 years ago, is a history of architecture in the Balkans, from Diocletian to Suleiman the Magnificent. So on the subject of painting, very broad canvases, books that will stay on shelves for a very long time. He was a wonderful example. And he was very, very good to me. He formed me intellectually. He was a very fine scholar, a great gentleman. And at some stage, maybe it was when I finished my undergraduate studies at Princeton and was about to come here as an MPhil student, we had dinner, and he said to me that the academic life can be extremely solitary. And he was speaking from experience. Now, that is changing. You know, the humanities, especially on this side of the ocean, increasingly are structured around scientific models that emphasize cooperation, teams, laboratories, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, most of what we do, whether you are a graduate student or a senior professor, is very solitary work. And this work will make its appearance in settings like this, where you can speak to others and present your work. At its most exciting, it can come in the form of book launches or when an article is published. But ultimately, the work is often extremely solitary. It's a monastic work. And in this sense, universities are still true to their origins as quasi-monastic institutions. So he said that to me, and I remember it was very sobering. Here I was, you know, thinking I was setting off on something that would be dynamic and interesting. And in a way, I felt like he was throwing cold water on the fire. But I've often thought of that advice in the years since, when I've come to appreciate it much, much more, that, you know, the academic life is not necessarily or very often at all a life full of accolades and successes and achievements. It is the work of often a solitary thinker and writer plugging away at a project for a very, very long time. And so you have to love what you do. You have to select projects that matter to you long before selecting projects that you think will matter to other people. If you don't believe in your project, no one else will. And if you're not interested in your project at the outset, no one else will be interested in it, you know, years from its inception when you're eventually finished, God willing. So that was one of the takeaways of that conversation. But I think that there's great dignity in kind of plowing away, regardless of what your conclusions are, whether they be vast and field-changing conclusions or more modest ones, that there is, I think, excitement in the process of discovery, the pursuit of truth, whatever that may mean in your particular field of study, and that one must be satisfied by the mundane routines of the academic life long before is satisfied or sustained by the more glorious or successful moments, because that's ultimately where a career is made, often by yourself in the library. So I don't know if that amounts to good advice, but that has certainly been my experience to date. And that's often what keeps me going when I'm nodding off trying to read one more thing, or the deadline for the eventual completion of a book seems so far off as to possibly never happen. That's often what keeps me going.
Okay, then I have another question because it's the deadline is far. And the deadline is close. And what is and about the solitary and monastic life? How do you manage to get the solitary and monastic life with 2 children and being an academic with all the administrative and teaching duties we have? I find it very, very difficult to find that monastic flow if we combine these two ideas, when you just sink into your work, and then there is no time, no work, no you just read and write, and so how do you manage to get this time?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a relatively new father. Most of my academic work was conducted under the previous regime of no children, which made it much easier. I mean, for instance, the book that I wrote today was the product of the COVID lockdown. I mean, the only reason I had the time to write was essentially an extra project was because the world came to a standstill. And unlike my situation now, I didn't have any children. But what do I do now that I do have small children? I mean, my life is seldom a routine of monastic focus. It's quite the opposite. But to the best of my abilities, I try to carve out small moments of time. And so I think if one believes that the only way to make progress is through, you know, large amounts of unstructured free time to think and read, you'll never get any work done. But by contrast, if one can be satisfied by plowing ahead with something as small as 10 or 15 minutes of work on your own research every day, eventually that will amount to something. And more importantly, when, say, a summer comes, or if someone is fortunate to get sabbatical leave due to a grant, something like that, if you're in the habit of working hard, if you're in the habit of focusing, and if you're in midstream in your thoughts, so to speak, sustained by those 15 minutes, it's much easier to do the really tough, long slog, kind of marathon style research that I think all of us crave, but don't necessarily have the headspace or the time to do. So that's what I try to do. I get up early in the morning. I try to work between appointments. I try to carve out afternoons or mornings, that kind of thing, work between terms. I don't say I succeed, but I aspire. And that's, we'll see. Check back with me if my children are older.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Christian. All right. So let's talk about your book now. So we start the formal, or not necessarily very formal, part of the presentation.
Maybe before I share my screen and start talking to you, I can very briefly say something. I mean, earlier we spoke about my own views of the shortcomings of the prevailing approaches to the field of Islamic history. I mean, another way to explain how I got interested in this was that if you're interested in everyone else that exists in the early Muslim empire, you begin to see the shortcomings of narratives that privilege elites or particular slices of society, and not the vast amount of everyone else. So my early work, and what initially got me interested in the field, was the earliest interactions between Muslims and Christians. And having finished some of that work, I started studying the interactions between Muslims and the other great non-Muslim community of the early Islamic empire. And when I say great, I'm basically talking about the second, what is probably the second most numerous, certainly most geographically widespread community after the Christians, and these are the Zoroastrians. So what I'll talk to you about today is in some ways part and parcel of a scholarly agenda at which I've been working for quite a while now, but in other ways it's a step in a new direction, but premised on this same interest in how Muslims interacted with the communities that they governed and lived alongside. And we, in general, know far less about the history of early Muslim-Zoroastrian relations than we do about the early history of, say, Muslim-Christian or Muslim-Jewish interactions. So I hope there's some novelty in this.
And well, again, this also reminds us of how much we see everything in some sort of retrospective way. Of course, the fact that Europe is Christian makes us to focus much more on Christians, and there is much more and lots of studies on Jews as well. Zoroastrians are much less studied due to the sheer fact that they are not as well represented today. But that doesn't mean that, yeah, that they were not immensely important. And then there are, of course, still other religions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, there are amazing sources to work through. If anyone here is interested in the history of Iran and the early Islamic period, or the history of Zoroastrians, any of that, there are amazing sources to work through from those vantage points that are seldom read. And so it was a very, in some ways, simplistic discovery that led me into this corpus of texts. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of the most interesting and one of the texts that speaks most immediately to these big themes of how the early Islamic empire was formed, religious change in Iran, that kind of stuff. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to read from a script, and that's partly so I managed to stay on time. And depending on how the clock is going afterwards, I have a few passages, but I'm eager to get to discussion, so we can perhaps reassess once I'm done. Okay, let me share my screen. Škand, how does that look? Can you see it? Yeah, okay. Okay. Let me just ask before I begin, can you see the screen? It says dialoguing in late antiquity?
No.
No, okay. How about that?
Yeah.
Okay, super.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right. So late antiquity, as my Oxford colleague Avril Cameron would remind us, was a time of intense dialogue and debate. When it came to theology, debates could sometimes take place between adherents of different religions, such as between pagans, Jews, and Christians, and sometimes between adherents of different branches of the same religion. For instance, between Arians and Nicenes, Chalcedonians and Miaphysites, Monothelites and Diothelites, to speak merely about Christians. This tradition did not die out with the rise of Islam. To the contrary, dialogue and debate were equally important features of the societies that grew up within the frontiers of the Islamic Caliphate. And to understand this, it's important to first grasp two technical terms from Arabophone theology, which you see on the screen in front of you. The first, kalam, and the second, munadara, and I'll explain these in turn. Kalam has two principal meanings. The first is a style of rationalist theological argumentation in which one speaks, kallama, with an adversary by reducing his or her position to a series of meaningless alternatives. The second is a specific school of Islamic theology, ilm al-kalam, which uses this method to advance arguments about the nature of God. Although the most famous practitioners of kalam in the Middle Ages were Muslims, and here I'm thinking especially of the Mu'tazilis, it was not, strictly speaking, an Islamic enterprise. Indeed, as Michael Cook, Yosef Fanes, and Jack Tanous have shown, kalam probably originated among Greek and Syriac-speaking Christians in late antiquity, before it was eventually adopted and adapted by the early Muslims. Furthermore, in the early Islamic period, there were plenty of Christian and Jewish practitioners of kalam. A practitioner of kalam is known as a mutakallim, plural mutakallimun. And these included the famous Theodore Abu Qurra, who dies sometime after 816 among the Melkites, or Sa'adia Gaon, who dies in 942 among the Rabbinate Jews. Zoroastrian intellectuals of the early Islamic period also practiced kalam, though we know precious little about them and their intellectual approaches. So the purpose of this lecture is to discuss our main window into the development of the Zoroastrian kalam tradition, namely a Middle Persian text called the Škand Gumānīg-Wizār. But more on this text in just a moment. A bit more background, I think, is necessary. So why did the techniques of kalam leap from Christian to Muslim circles in the early Islamic period? And why does this matter for understanding early Muslim-Zoroastrian relations? Yosef Fanes offered a compelling and concise answer to this question. Quote, "Whoever was so bold as to engage in discussion beyond the bounds of his own religion would have to renounce the authority of Scripture. He could only be convincing by means of generally applicable proofs." So, put differently, kalam offered a tool for theological engagement between religious groups who did not necessarily share a common doctrinal or scriptural grammar. Now, the actual setting in which dialogue and debate took place was a munadara, or a disputation, the second of our Arabic key terms. The word derives from the term nadar, meaning speculative reasoning, which was the focus of these gatherings. Munadarat were often convened by high-ranking Muslims, including the Caliph himself, with the goal of gathering scholars from different religious backgrounds to discuss matters of theological and philosophical common interest. Now, of perhaps special interest to this group, given the name of the series that Ishban runs, munadarat often took place in a physical setting called a majlis, a gathering in which people would sit and discuss. They're not quite interchangeable terms, but majlis and munadara are closely linked. Because participants in these debates did not necessarily share common scriptures or beliefs, they had to rely on the techniques of kalam to defend themselves and to attack their opponents. A typical debate would feature theologians from an array of Muslim as well as non-Muslim backgrounds, including Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, the last of whom interest us most today. Now, the purpose of this lecture is to investigate what Zoroastrians probably said in these settings. In particular, the rational arguments they wielded against Muslims, who constituted their primary religious rivals from the 7th century onward. And the best way to understand their arguments is to look at the Škand Gumānīg-Wizār, which I translate as Doubt-Dispelling Disquisition, a unique Middle Persian work of the 9th or 10th centuries, written by the theologian and philosopher Mardānfarrox, son of Ohrmazddād, possibly in Baghdad or another cosmopolitan center of the Eastern Empire. One of my central claims in the book and before you today is that the Škand contains a record of what Zoroastrians probably said at these interreligious debates, and/or the text was written to inform Zoroastrian polemicists who engaged in precisely such disputations. The Škand is the most important polemical treatise in classical Zoroastrian literature. It's composed in a style of rationalist philosophy or theology resembling kalam. Indeed, as I said, it provides our best window onto the development of a distinctively Zoroastrian kalam tradition. In terms of its contents, the Škand contains a lengthy exposition of Zoroastrian first principles, that's the first part of the text, as well as detailed critiques of several rival religions. It's the second part of the text. Those include Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Manichaeism. The overall work consists of 16 chapters, 1,600 lines, and 20,000 words spread across 178 pages in the modern printed edition. The critique of Islam found in chapters 11 and 12 of the Škand constitutes the single longest section of the entire text, clocking in at 465 lines and 6,000 words spread across 48 pages in the modern printed edition. So the book that I published, whose image you see on the screen in front of you, is a study and translation, not of the whole text, but of the chapters that relate to Islam. Now, not only is the critique of Islam, in some sense, the heart of the overall work, it is also the only explicit polemic against Islam we find anywhere in classical Zoroastrian literature. This basic fact, seldom acknowledged by scholars of Zoroastrianism or Islamic studies, is remarkable, considering the intense rivalry that erupted between Zoroastrians and Muslims from the 7th century onward. Its uniqueness is all the more striking, considering that Christians, and to a lesser extent Jews, penned numerous critiques of Islam, often drawing on the techniques of kalam to do so. It is also striking, considering that Muslim theologians often wrote about and against Zoroastrianism, which they called in Arabic al-Majusiyya, or Magianism. But, with the exception of the Škand, Zoroastrians never offered their own explicit critique of Islam. So in other words, this is an extremely interesting text from both the Zoroastrian as well as the Islamic angle. The text author, Mardānfarrox, is also an extremely unique figure. To begin with, he claims to have been a layman, not a priest, which, if true, would make him radically different to nearly every other Zoroastrian author of the period. Again, if this is true, it could explain why the Škand looks so different in both style and content to nearly every other example of Zoroastrian literature from this time, which tends to focus on priestly topics, what I call priestly topics, such as exegesis, ritual, law. Another interesting aspect of Mardānfarrox's biography is his claim to have undertaken a spiritual journey as a younger man, and at the end of this journey, to have experienced a profound change of heart. Specifically, he hints that he dabbled in Manichaeism, for which modern scholars have sometimes called him a Zoroastrian Saint Augustine, Augustine being that other great youthful convert to Manichaeism in late antiquity. But Mardānfarrox states he later returned to Zoroastrianism. And his goal in writing the Škand, so he tells us, was to help other Zoroastrians overcome their doubts and to fortify their beliefs in what Zoroastrians called the good religion. Mardānfarrox almost certainly wrote the Škand in Pahlavi, but the oldest surviving version of the text is in a related form of Middle Persian known as Pawzand. Pawzand is Middle Persian written in the Avestan script, which first emerged in 12th century India. And I'm happy to talk about the development of that script, which is an important aspect of the history of this text, but that's all I'll say now in the interest of getting ahead. The oldest surviving manuscript of the Škand, which is incomplete, comes from India and dates to the year 1475. So the Indian provenance of the manuscript and the late medieval, early modern date is fully consistent with the vast majority of surviving Zoroastrian literature. Now, With this background out of the way, let me turn to the Islamic sections of the Škand. What do they suggest about the polemics that Zoroastrian intellectuals crafted to counter Muslims in the early Islamic period? To understand the question, we have to first understand the overarching goals of the text. The first is to offer a rationalist defense of dualism. That is, the central Zoroastrian tenet that the world is caught in a great struggle between two cosmic antagonists, Ohrmazd, the creator god, and Ahrimen, whom the Zoroastrians called the foul spirit. The second goal of the text is to attack rival religions that rejected this belief in one way or another. The most important were the scriptural monotheisms, including Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And as we have seen, the Škand also critiques Manichaeism, a rival form of dualism from late antiquity. And this, if we want to believe the story, may reflect Mardānfarrox's youthful dalliance with Manichaeism. Zoroastrians have long been dualists. Prior to the Škand, Zoroastrian authors seldom focused on dualism as the organizing principle of their religious worldview. The new explicit emphasis on dualism we see in the text was a response to the critiques of monotheists, above all Muslims, who categorized Zoroastrianism and other dualist religions under the umbrella of what they called in Arabic al-Thanawiyya. In a way, Zoroastrians embraced this label. They embraced the label of al-Thanawiyya, originally a polemical term imposed by outsiders, as a way of differentiating themselves from monotheists and from pagans in the intensely competitive religious marketplace of the early Islamic period. At an intellectual level, Zoroastrians leaned into dualism in order to demonstrate the logical fallacies inherent in monotheism, at least as they saw them. Namely, its failure to provide convincing answers to the problem of evil. For Mardānfarrox, the only way to deal with this ancient philosophical dilemma, how a God who is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, could also permit the existence of evil in the world, the only way to square the circle, so to speak, was to accept that there was not one principle residing over creation, but in fact two, Ohrmazddād and Ahrimen, one of whom was fully good, the other of whom was fully evil. Very little of Mardānfarrox's critique concerned Islam directly. Rather, he focused on Islam as the quintessential and most significant expression of the error of monotheism. The heart of his argument was theodicy, the aforementioned problem of evil or the justice of God, to which he believed Islam and all monotheistic religions offered an unsatisfying answer. Mardānfarrox, the monotheistic God, could be either all good but not all powerful, and therefore unable to contain the spread of evil in the world, or he could be all powerful but not all good, indifferent to the evil he permitted to exist. Zoroastrianism offered an escape hatch, so to speak, by upholding the existence of two cosmic principles who, in their respective goodness and evil, were responsible for all good and evil in creation. In this sense, it's interesting that the Škand offers no rebuttal to common Islamic critiques of Zoroastrianism. This includes contentious issues such as Zoroaster's status as a prophet, which Muslims disputed, the Avesta's status as a divine revelation, which Muslims also disputed, and controversial, much derided practices such as Khwedodar, or next of kin marriage. Furthermore, the Škand never mentions the Prophet Muhammad, and it makes, at best, vague allusions to the text of the Quran. This is in contrast to Christian and Jewish polemics of the early Islamic period, which often demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of Islamic doctrine, history, and literature, going so far as to quote passages from the Quran and Hadith, and recounting actual episodes from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. The absence of specific counter-polemics can perhaps be understood as a consequence of the Škand's overarching intellectual agenda, namely, to transform Zoroastrianism into an abstract theological system, which could be defended through logical proofs. This entailed also transforming rival religions into their own abstract theological systems, which could be torn down through the powers of reason. Seen in this light, there may have been no reason to engage Islamic doctrine, history, and literature other than to undermine the central Islamic and monotheistic tenet that there is one God. The Škand is a highly innovative work, but its arguments did not emerge from the ether. It built upon embryonic and often indirect polemics against Islam found in earlier Zoroastrian literature, such as the famous Dane-card known to some of you on the call. The Škand also seems to have incorporated rationalist critiques of Islam pioneered by a group of non-Zoroastrian dualists, often called Zindiqs, sometimes translated as Manichaeans, whose literature has essentially disappeared, save for short quotations in hostile Muslim works. And here I have to nod in the direction of our host István, who's the great authority on this, and from whom I learned a great deal in the process of writing my book. As István would tell you himself, the best window into this are the anti-Islamic polemics of these Zindiqs is a work ascribed to Ibn al-Muqaffa'a, who dies in 757. Ibn al-Muqaffa'a, of course, was an Iranian convert to Islam who served as a high-ranking Abbasid official, and perhaps more famously is remembered as one of the great pioneers of classical Arabic literature, for instance, the translator of the famous Kalila wa Dimna. Now, despite his outward adherence to Islam, Ibn al-Muqaffa'a seems to have written several poisonous treatises against Islam, which show important parallels to the rationalist arguments against Islam we also find in the Škand. Within the chapters on Islam, the most important targets of Mardānfarrox's attacks were the Mu'tazilis, whom he mentions by name in chapter 11. The Mu'tazilis, of course, were the dominant intellectuals of the early Abbasid period and the premier practitioners of kalam. In many ways, we can read the Islamic sections of the Škand as a rebuttal to Islam generally and to Mu'tazilis specifically. The Mu'tazilis were often called the Ahl al-Tawhid wal-Adl, meaning those who uphold God's oneness and his justice, because of their emphasis on these pillars of Islamic thought. The Islamic sections of the Škand systematically dismantle these ideas, arguing that there cannot be a single cosmic principle capable of both good and evil, as Mardānfarrox thought was true of the Muslim God. But instead, there must be two separate principles, each capable of good or evil. Furthermore, the Islamic sections of the work argue that a monotheistic God is not just at all, as the Mu'tazilis did, but understood as the Muslims do, God is actually unjust. He is capricious, and he is lacking in mercy. Thus, the overarching agenda of the chapters is to challenge what the Mu'tazilis took to be the most essential in matters of religion. Now, this is but the tip of the iceberg of more specific Islamic doctrines that come in for attack in the Škand, most of them from the theological canon of the Mu'tazilis. This, in turn, demonstrates Mardānfarrox's intimate knowledge of Islamic theological concepts and his talent for inverting these concepts in order to defend Zoroastrianism and to undermine Islam. So with that, I will wrap up. István, shall we go to the Q&A, or do you think there's interest or time in seeing a passage or two before questions? Whatever you prefer.
I'm happy to continue. So go ahead with the text. Yes. Okay. We can stay longer. We tend to stay longer.
Okay, great. Well, let me. I won't keep people too long, but let me just give you maybe two passages. Okay. So a good place to start is at the beginning. These are the opening lines of the Islamic sections of the Škand. Among other things, Mardānfarrox states that his overarching goal is to expose the logical contradictions and hence, in his view, fallacies of competing religions. It is also interesting to note how Mardānfarrox speaks about monotheism, namely as belief in the existence of a single cosmic principle, what he calls in Middle Persian a bun. He uses this term bun more commonly than Yazd, which is the Middle Persian as well as the New Persian term for God. He then seems to echo certain epithets of God in the Islamic tradition, namely Ar-Rahman, the generous, the merciful, and Al-Ghaffar, the forgiving. He does this while also nodding in the direction of the central Mu'tazili doctrine that God is just. So that's the kind of summary, and let me read this for you now. From this point, I will write about the contradiction, Hanbas-Soni, which is between their idle chatter and the observable truth. First of all, those who believe there is only one principle, this is that term, this is a slight variation on the term bunisht, or principle, who say there is one God who is beneficent, knowing, powerful, generous, and forgiving. Those are those quasi-Islamic epithets here written in Middle Persian. Who say that good deeds and evil deeds, truth and falsehood, life and death, goodness and wickedness come from him. Now ask them, and this is part of the dialectical structure of the text, like many works of kalam, and indeed works of dialectical theology going back to late antiquity, the text is often structured around a question and answer format. Now ask them this, and if they say this, then you say that. So now ask them, is God always generous, forgiving, beneficent, and just? And here's that common term in the text, just, Doubt-Dispelling, which seems to be perhaps a reply to the Mu'tazilis. 4, if he is generous, beneficent, and forgiving, then why did he cast Ahriman, the demon, hell, and all bad punishment upon his own creatures, by his own generosity, beneficence, and forgiveness? So in other words, he's basically posing the central question that he will continue to pick at for the duration of these chapters, and indeed for the duration of the whole text. How can we understand there to be a single God who is all good, etc., who at the same time allows Ahriman to wreak havoc over his creation? So this is a nice way of seeing how he frames the text and introduces some of the key themes. Let me give you one more example of how Mardānfarrox seems to be aware of very specific doctrines and discourses in Islamic theology. This comes from these are the opening lines of chapter 12, the shorter second chapter of the section of the text dealing with Islam. In this passage, Mardānfarrox returns to the internal contradictions of his Muslim opponents. He skewers them for holding a range of clashing positions about specific theological issues, in this case, the bodily attributes of God, which, as many of you will know, was a major debate among Muslims at the time. Most famously, the debate focused on the question of God's throne. In Arabic is Arsh al-Kursi, which is mentioned many times in the Quran. Some Muslims, including the Jahmis and the Mu'tazilis, interpreted these verses metaphorically, understanding God to be omnipresent and not literally bound to a physical throne. Others, including proto-Sunni groups such as the Hanbalis, interpreted these verses literally and therefore tried to understand the relationship of God to the throne on which he sat. The disagreement sparked a great debate about the manner of God's sitting on the throne, in Arabic, istiwa al-arsh, which Mardānfarrox lampoons here. So let me just read this to you. As for what they say, God is around everything and nothing is inside him. And he is inside everything and nothing is around him. He is above everything and nothing is below him. And he is below everything and nothing is above him. He sits upon a throne, yet he has no place. And he is inside the sky, yet has no whereabouts. And he does not exist in any place, yet he exists. He exists in every place, yet has no place. So again, Mardānfarrox is not taking a side in this particular and contentious debate. Rather, he observing the wide range of contradictory opinions and taking this as evidence for the fundamental untruth of Islam, specifically and monotheism generally. So there are other passages I could talk about, but maybe I'll stop there in the interest of getting started on discussion. So again, thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Christian. And I guess we would be happy to hear more quotations, but then you would end up quoting your whole translation. So yes, I will stop the recording, thanking you again, and I think we are looking forward to a very interesting discussion.